Hello, my name is Dr. Aidan Elliott and welcome to this visual summary of An Inspector Calls. An Inspector Calls is set in the spring of 1912 and explores three key themes: social responsibility, class inequality, and moral hypocrisy. And as the story develops, each member of the Burling family will be questioned by a police inspector and asked to what degree they feel responsible for the recent death of a young woman. To give you a very quick overview, in Act 1 he will question Mr. Burling and his daughter Sheila Burling. In Act 2 he'll question Sheila's fiancé Gerald and Mrs. Burling. And in Act 3 he will question Sheila's younger brother Eric Burling. The inspector will then leave, and the characters then discuss to what degree they do or do not feel responsible for the girl's death. And then lastly, in the very final moments of the play comes another twist. But more of that later. So as the play opens, we meet the Burling family who are celebrating the engagement of their daughter Sheila to Gerald Croft. And we do hear, though, that Sheila didn't see Gerald at all the previous summer because he was busy at work, which leaves us with a question. Mr. Burling is a prosperous businessman, and he predicts that there will be no world war and the Titanic is unsinkable. This is dramatic irony because we know there will be a war and that the Titanic sank. And the real purpose of these statements is to throw doubt on his judgment. So when he says that every man must look after himself, that's his only responsibility, we begin to doubt whether this is true. Now, as the family revels in their happiness, the doorbell rings and Inspector Gould arrives, disrupting the festivities. He announces that a young woman named Eva Smith has died after ingesting disinfectant, and that he is conducting an inquiry into her death. Each family member is then interrogated about their connection to Eva, revealing their complicity in her tragic fate. Mr. Burling, for example, is revealed to have dismissed Eva from his factory 2 years earlier for demanding a pay rise. But he says this is a long time ago and he was only doing what any good businessman would do, keeping costs down and getting rid of troublemakers. He is adamant that whatever has happened to Eva, it is nothing to do with him. It is then revealed that Eva Smith got a job in a department store called Millward's. But then she got fired after a customer complained about her, and that customer was Sheila Burling. Sheila admits that she had complained to the manager because she thought Eva was laughing at her and threatened never to return to the store unless the girl was sacked. Unlike Mr. Burling, Sheila realises that she was in the wrong and that she was jealous because Eva looked better in the dress than she did. So she admits that she is at least partly responsible for Eva's fate. The inspector then reveals that after leaving Millward's, Eva Smith was then known as Daisy Renton, at which point Gerald reacts, and Sheila realises in that moment that Gerald knew Daisy Renton. Gerald does not deny a relationship, but, just like Mr. Burling, claims that her death is nothing to do with him. As Act 2 opens, Gerald admits that he did know Daisy Renton, so he was also involved in her life. He'd met her in a bar the previous summer and initially did a good thing by finding her somewhere to live and providing financial support. But this also turned into a relationship, and that was the reason he didn't see his fiancée Sheila the previous summer. He really wasn't just busy at work. Ultimately, Gerald ended the relationship with Daisy Renton because it couldn't last. They couldn't marry because she was from a lower social class. But of course, this effectively means that he was exploiting her for sex. Sheila now returns her engagement ring to Gerald upon learning the truth about his affair. Now the focus moves to Mrs. Burling, and when she is shown a photo of the young woman, she says, "I don't know her." But the inspector immediately accuses her of lying. And Sheila also says that her mother did recognise the woman in the photo. Mrs. Burling then admits that Eva had visited the Brumley Women's Charity Organisation just 2 weeks earlier because she had no money and nowhere to live. However, Mrs. Burling refused to help her because she was using Mrs. Burling's own name and claimed to be married. The inspector then reveals that Eva was also pregnant when she died, but Mrs. Burling is unmoved. She was aware that Eva was pregnant, but says it is the father's responsibility to look after the child and that he should be compelled to marry Eva. What's more, Eva knew who the father was, but said he was unsuitable because 1, he was young, silly and drank too much, and 2, he had stolen money to help Eva and she did not want to accept stolen money. Needless to say, the highly prejudiced Mrs. Burling simply couldn't believe that a lower-class girl like Eva would refuse money, stolen or otherwise, and she restates her opinion that the young man who got Eva pregnant is entirely responsible and that he ought to be dealt with very severely. It is at this point that Sheila realises that the silly boy who drinks too much is her brother Eric, and she tries to tell her mother to be quiet. But at this moment, Eric walks into the room. And so Act 3 begins with Eric realising that he is the one who got the young woman pregnant. Like Gerald, he'd met her in a bar. But unlike Gerald, he'd got drunk, gone home with Eva and forced her to let him into her apartment. He then began a sexual relationship with Eva and she became pregnant. Eric reveals that he stole money from his father to support Eva because she didn't want to try and get another job. Eric then confirms that Eva ended the relationship when she realised Eric was stealing, and that is when she went to Mrs. Burling for help and was rejected. Eric angrily points out that by refusing to help, Mrs. Burling has helped to kill both Eva and her own grandchild. The inspector says that they now know that each of them had a role in the death of Eva. And he looks at Mrs. Burling in particular, saying, "Remember what you did. You turned her away when she most needed help." The inspector then says that we should all feel responsible for helping each other, not just for looking after ourselves. And this is the exact opposite of what Mr. Burling said at the beginning of the play. But when the inspector leaves, Mr. Burling immediately tries to shift the blame onto Eric and maintains that the death of Eva is nothing to do with him. Cuttingly, Eric says he doesn't blame his parents, but he is ashamed of them. Sheila is also ashamed of her own actions, but she's even more disappointed that her parents are trying to pretend that nothing has happened. Gerald then reveals that no one at the police station has even heard of Inspector Gould. He's a fake. The older Burlings and Gerald are delighted because that means there will be no criminal charges. But Sheila and Eric know that they are all morally responsible for Eva's death. Gerald questions this. He says it could have been 5 different women because they were never shown photos at the same time. And to support his point, he rings the hospital and discovers there's no record of anyone swallowing disinfectant or committing suicide. Gerald and Mr. and Mrs. Burling are now very pleased with themselves. It's all a hoax and they're not guilty of anything. But Sheila is still not happy, even if it was separate women and even if none of them died. They are still morally responsible for what each of them did. Everything that happened actually happened to somebody, and none of those actions are morally defensible. But Burling is happy again and he mocks Sheila and Eric for falling for the hoax, at which point the phone rings. It's the police. A girl has just died on her way to the infirmary after swallowing some disinfectant, and a police inspector is on his way to ask some questions. So in conclusion, An Inspector Calls is a compelling drama that challenges us to reflect on our own values and responsibilities. As Inspector Gould says, we are all responsible for each other, reminding us of the enduring importance of empathy, compassion, and social justice. So I hope this brief video has given you a way of memorising the main moments in An Inspector Calls, and that it will be useful for you when revising for exams or when reading or watching the play. Give a thumbs up if you've enjoyed this video, and subscribe now so that you don't miss any of my future posts.